FDR's gold confiscation order in 1933, this is Executive Order 6102, was an attempt to remove most gold from private ownership and use as money. Now, on the one hand, due to widespread noncompliance, it was a pretty serious failure on the first part of that. But the second part, because the resistance didn't go far enough, it was also a pretty massive success. So today, I've got a quick overview of EO 6102, plus a few other acts they did around that time, why they did it. I think the motive is very important, how it played out in practice, plus maybe some lessons to think about for today. Let's kick this off. First of all, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the Fast Friday edition of the show for May 17th, 2024. And here from an article we just published by Mike Meharry, he points out that on April 5th, 1933, FDR signed Executive Order 6102. He justified the move based on the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, as amended by the Emergency Banking Act in March of 1933. Retroactive. We'll get to that in a moment. Anyways, one provision in the 1917 law. So here's something on the books for quite some time. In emergency situations, this is what people in power do. They look back to old acts that are still on the books, statute, and say, what can I use this for? It empowered the president to regulate or prohibit under such rules and regulations as he may prescribe any transactions in foreign exchange, export, or earmarkings of gold or silver coin or bullion or currency by any person within the United States. So based on that, on March 6th of 1933, FDR declares a national emergency under Section 5B of that Trading with the Enemies Act of 1917. It authorized him to supposedly declare a bank holiday to prevent what he called the hoarding of gold. Hoarding is a very important word in this story. The president invoked this authority, Mike writes, even though the section expressly limited presidential power to wartime. So even though it said you can only do this in certain scenarios, this is an important lesson. Once you give government power to do something in an emergency, it establishes what John Dickinson called, in response to the Stamp Act, the detestable precedent. Even if you think it's just for one situation, they will always try to expand it and grow it over time. You'll find someone in the future that uses it in new and more expansive ways. And this is another example of this. There's so many of them. Anyways, even though this happened, he wasn't authorized to do it. He did it anyways. Then 3 days later, Congress retroactively amended the section to allow the president to take action during time of war or during any other period of national emergency declared by the president. This was under the Emergency Banking Act of 1933. This just shows the hubris of these people. Now, here's the full act, the Emergency Banking Act, and provisions in that gave the Secretary of the Treasury the power to require all individuals and corporations to hand over all their gold coin, their bullion, gold certificates, if in his judgment, sole judgment of the Secretary of the Treasury, such action is necessary to protect the currency system of the United States. And this served as the legal justification for Executive Order 6102. It was also a strategic error on their part. I'll get to that in just a moment. But the important context here, Meharry points out that at the time, the U.S. was in the grip of the Great Depression. A lot of people, he writes, were redeeming paper dollars for physical gold, which we shouldn't be surprised about. If there's an economic crisis, the Great Depression of all things, people are going to turn to something safer than paper money. And they were losing faith in the paper currency. This caused significant problems for the federal government because the dollar was tethered to gold and thus printing of it was at least somewhat limited. And that gets into the motive, which I'll get to in just a few minutes. But during a fireside chat in March of 33, FDR called this exchange of paper notes for gold, he called it hoarding. And it was considered, hoarding, of course, is considered a terrible thing when it comes to sound money. Now, he claimed this hoarding, he claimed the hoarding was undermining the entire banking system. And here he says, because of undermined confidence on the part of the public, there was a general rush by a large portion of our population to turn bank deposits into currency or gold, a rush so great that the soundest banks could not get enough currency to meet the demand. Of course, I would make the case, I would just state the position that if they couldn't exchange their paper dollars for gold, and the banks were collapsing, and it took all these emergency measures. The banks were not sound in the first place. The whole system was unsound. But anyways, back to Meharry. He said this carried forward to EO 6102. Stopping hoarding was the public rationale, but it went far beyond merely taking large amounts of gold from these so-called hoarders. By creating an expansive definition of hoarding, this is what government does, whether it's regulate commerce or necessary and proper or whatever it may be. They always use expansive definitions of these terms to give themselves more power. So they did this with hoarding. It was designed to take virtually all gold coins and bars out of private hands and transfer them to the government. And here from Executive Order 6102, the title is Forbidding the Hoarding of Gold Coin, Gold Bullion, and Gold Certificates. You can read it in full. It'll be linked to in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. I get a blog post published for every episode a couple hours after each live stream is done. But here, FDR writes, the term hoarding means the withdrawal and withholding of gold coin, gold bullion, or gold certificates from the recognized and customary channels of trade. The term person means any individual, partnership, association, or corporation. So, I mean, if you think about it, there were some small exceptions to this. Like you could keep up to $100 worth, or if you're using it in manufacturing, because gold is used in all kinds of stuff, then you didn't have to turn that in. But anyone who wanted to hold their gold, any significant amount of it as savings, was considered to be hoarding. And this is what they were ordered to do. All persons are hereby required to deliver on or before May 1st, 1933, to a Federal Reserve Bank or a branch or agency thereof, or to any member bank of the Federal Reserve System, all gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates now owned by them or coming into their ownership on or before April 28th. So really quick turnaround. Everybody, turn it all in. Mr. and Mrs. American, turn it in. Now, it wasn't just a pure robbery, like give it to us. They tried to give it some kind of window dressing of an honest exchange, and they paid people out $20.67 an ounce. Remember that number, because we're going to come back to that number when they manipulate it a little bit later on. But this brings me to the motive. Why they did this. And Meharry really puts it, he really nails it here. He said, with the dollar tied to gold, the Federal Reserve could not significantly increase the money supply during the Great Depression. Monetary stimulus, an increase of money supply. This is the standard Keynesian response to any economic crisis, downturn, depression, recession, anything. It's also the number one way that supporters of the monster state want to give more power to, well, the monster state. Anyways, Meharry says they couldn't just simply fire up the printing press as it does now. The Federal Reserve Act, you might be surprised to know, it actually required the central bank to hold enough gold to back at least 40% of the notes in circulation. But because people were exchanging the notes for gold, they were low on gold and up against the limit. So FDR wanted the Fed to increase the money supply to give them more power to do more stuff, more government spending, but he had a hard limit based on this, I guess, partial gold standard. And Mike writes, by transferring gold from the public to the Federal Reserve, the central bank boosted its reserve holdings, allowing it to print more money than it was previously able to do so. So the motive is all about money printing and government power. That's what it always was. And it probably always will be. Now, this was actually the second major step against sound money. A few weeks earlier, on March 10th, 1933, FDR issued another executive order, 6073, which prohibited banks from paying out or exporting gold. And then we also have, a year later, we also have the Gold Reserve Act of 1934. And in practice, the law basically transformed gold from money, from a currency, into a commodity. They did not want people using it in day-to-day transactions. They wanted people on the fiat like we have today. Meharry points out that one of the most significant provisions in that law in 1934 erased the right of creditors to demand payment in gold. In practice, this forced debtors to make payments in whatever the government declared was legal tender. Gold couldn't even be used as the basis for determining how much paper money was owed. So this is just relentless. So that was the Gold Reserve Act of 1934. And once that was passed, the very next day, we get another Another statement from FDR, Proclamation 2072. And now that people had been selling their gold voluntarily, some of them were selling gold at $20.67. FDR then all of a sudden unilaterally under Proclamation 2072, January 31st, 34, he jacked up the value to 35 cents an ounce, $35 an ounce once they got it. And here's why. Again, it gets back to money printing. Mike says this effectively boosted the value of gold on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet by 69%. So we paid you $20 for this. Now it's worth $35 and we can print enough money that's backed by $35 worth of per ounce of gold. And Mike says by increasing its gold stores through the transfer of private gold to the Fed and then declaring a higher rate, the Fed was able to circulate more paper money. In effect, the hoarding of gold by the government allowed it to inflate the money supply. So the real hoarders were the government. Always were, always will be. Now, when it comes down to compliance on this, we have some research, but it's hard to get exact numbers on this. And Mike says the total amount of gold turned in to the Fed remains unclear because the central bank isn't required to disclose detailed accounting. However, in their book, A Monetary History of the United States, Milton Friedman and Anna Jacobson Schwartz estimated that the amount was relatively small and that most people simply ignored the order. They specifically said the bulk of the gold in circulation was retained illegally in private hands. I like that illegally, we can put around scare quotes, but they were defying this order. According to their calculations, Mike writes, Americans turned in about 20 to 25% of gold held in private hands at the time. In other words, a large percent of people simply ignored the order. We don't know numbers of people who turned in versus kept it, but of all the gold that was estimated to be in circulation, only about 20 to 25% was turned in. I consider that a huge success for Liberty, but we're missing another part here. Anyways, I've got a YouTube video that I think is worth checking out as well that Mike linked to in his article, How Much Gold Was Confiscated in 1933. This was published by SD Bullion a couple of years ago. They did some research on this that verifies, at least according to what they did, that approximately 20-25% turned in number, 20-25% of the total value turned in. That'll be linked to in the show notes as well. So that doesn't mean that the government did not try to enforce it. They certainly got a significant, but not huge amount of voluntary compliance. It was bad enough, but a vast majority did not comply. First one to get prosecuted was a guy named Frederick Barber Campbell. He had over 5,000 ounces of gold on deposit at a Chase National Bank, but the bank refused his request to withdraw the gold after Roosevelt issued the executive orders. So Campbell then sues the bank. He wants to get his gold. And it was only after that, when he sued, the bank was banned from giving it to him. And then he sued to get it, and that got him into the crosshairs of the feds. He was prosecuted. On appeal, it was overturned, but check this out. A judge overturned the prosecution, Mike writes, because the president signed Executive Order 6102. Earlier on, I mentioned that they made an error by not having the Secretary of the Treasury do it, and this is how it played out in practice. So they actually overturned the prosecution because it needed to be signed by the Treasury Secretary as required by the Banking Act of 1933. But the court still upheld the federal government's authority to confiscate gold and still seized Campbell's holdings. So they still took his 5,000 ounces of gold, which is a massive amount of money, whether it's in today's dollar value or in 1933 dollar value. It's a huge amount. He just didn't get a $10,000 fine in prison or anything like that. So the prosecution was overturned, but they still robbed him. But anyways, this caused the Roosevelt administration to issue another order. So again, we'll just authorize this special decree, and even though it's not allowed except in wartime, we'll do it, and then you can retroactively fix it. And this is the same thing that they're doing on the prosecution end. So a new order was issued under the signature of the Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau Jr. We got Executive Orders 6260, 6261. They provided for the seizure of gold and the prosecution of hoarders. A few months later, Congress passed the Gold Reserve Act of 1934, which then gave legislative permanence. So they're just ruling by executive order and then hoping they can convince Congress to back them up and then pass the law after the fact. So, I mean, in a way, they're getting away with this. They're just pushing forward. It's a very aggressive approach. This is arbitrary power. This is undefined, unlimited power. They just get to do what they want until someone else stops them. That's arbitrary power. It's one of the injuries and usurpations. One of the grievances is what we call them in the Declaration of Independence, and it needs to be aggressively resisted. But anyway, so they passed this, and then we have a new set of Treasury regulations which were issued providing civil penalties of confiscation of all gold and impositions of fines equal to double the value of the gold seized. So the penalties were really to scare people off. Like, even though they couldn't convince everyone to voluntarily turn stuff in, and not a vast majority did not, I think the penalties were there to scare people off from using gold as money and therefore having to default to the fiat dollar, which is what powers the monster state of today. It did back then, and it's much worse now because of it. Now, Mike writes, following the pattern that Campbell established, most of the prosecutions, even under the Secretary of the Treasury executive orders, they happened after people got caught in sting actions trying to illegally sell gold, or they otherwise did things that brought attention to their illegal gold. We don't know exactly how many people were prosecuted, but it was a small number. There weren't very many that got prosecuted. Most of them, though, involved individuals trying to sell gold. There are zero, absolutely zero, no recorded cases of any person being prosecuted merely because they had gold in their homes. They don't have the resources to do that kind of thing. They never did, they never will, and maybe there was a much more aggressively armed population at the time. I'm not sure. But by and large, Mike says, Roosevelt's gold confiscation largely relied on voluntary compliance. The federal government made zero effort, no effort to hunt down people who quietly ignored the order. And I think that gives us a few lessons for today. On the one hand, the feds don't have the resources to do massive door-to-door confiscations of anything from millions of people. I don't think they ever did, and I don't think they ever will, at least under how things are today. Massive noncompliance did mean that millions of people illegally kept their gold despite federal orders to the contrary. But on the other hand, the defiance was mostly in private. It was about holding on to it safely, not drawing much attention to yourself because the fines and the penalties, they were very aggressive about that when you were out in the open. And because of that, how many businesses would be willing to accept gold in exchange? You are probably afraid it might be a sting or you'd get busted, et cetera, et cetera. And so the result of that, I think, was probably the more important part of this. Even though they wanted to inflate the money supply, the long-term impact has been much worse. Even though they weren't able to get a full 100% of gold turned in and then inflate the money supply much more, they certainly got enough where they were able to print much more and have more government power at the time. But it created a scenario where the population just got in the habit of no longer using gold and silver, or gold specifically in this scenario, as money. And I think that is really the situation the government wants. They want us to use fiat. They don't want us to use sound money. So for today, I think even if you had a money that was totally unconfiscatable, if there was no way for government to get its hands on it, if the government passes a law or issues an order that says it's illegal to use it as money, and they're going to issue a bunch of large fines, there's going to be a lot of businesses. In fact, a vast majority of them are just going to say, no way, I don't want to risk my livelihood in order for you to continue doing business in sound money. And I think as long as the people comply with that, whether it was back then or today or in the future, the result is going to be the same. Ultimately, I think James Otis Jr. summed it up best. He said, so long as people will submit to arbitrary measures, so long will they find masters. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational, more important than anything. I hope you learned something. If you want to help us reach and teach more people about this essential information, nothing helps us do this work more every single day, more than the financial faith and support of our members. We're talking about dirty government fiat. If you got a couple of bucks of that, please consider throwing it our way. over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We use every single dollar of their garbage to take a stand for the Constitution and liberty, whether the government likes it or not. I can assure you they do not. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Our membership program starts out at $2 a month. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. I'd be very grateful for any consideration you can give to joining us today. Thank you again for spending some of your time with me today. I hope you have a great day. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you have an awesome weekend. And I hope to see you next week here on the path to liberty.